Thanks so much. This is a really exciting and important training. I know that it's been a rough year for everyone. And we presented this a year ago. If you were with us last year, thank you for coming back. If you weren't with us last year, welcome. You're going to hear, if you were with us, you're going to hear some updates from our presenter, Katie Greeley. But just first want to give a big shout out to the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol Programs. They have tasked our organization, I should say, by the way, I'm Kim Porter, I'm the executive director of Be a Part of the Conversation. And they have tasked us with this wonderful project called the Youth Marijuana Prevention Project, which we are now in the concluding the second of 5 years that this project will be going on. It's got a lot of different facets to it, but this part we feel is really important because you have such an important role with your students, with your colleagues, and so on. I know we have some prevention providers with us as well as educators, but welcome to all. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn it right over to Katie Greeley, who is going to take really good care of you for the next 3 hours.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Just like to check before we jump in. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Montgomery County. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's early morning, 8 a.m. Here we are. We got 3 hours together. So I'm going to try to make it as exciting and as engaging as possible. My name's Katie Greeley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and founder of Prevention Education Solutions, who works very closely with Kim and Judy to be a part of the conversation, and also Montgomery County in other capacities. So I'm really excited to have you all here to talk about marijuana and the impact it has on youth and the impact you can have as educators on youth. For those of you who joined us last year, right, so some things about this training. Some things are gonna stay the same. We're gonna review some information on marijuana, right? It is a complex topic. There's a lot of information to know, and I think the foundations are very important when it comes to having this conversation. And then, as 2020 and 2021 showed us, some things are very different, and some things change very quickly, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. All right. I can find it. There we go. All right. So we have several objectives for this afternoon. The first 3 we're going to cover in the first half of the training. That will be about for an hour and a half. We're going to go over some information. We're going to talk about the various forms of marijuana, methods of consumption, how things have changed, and trends in use, adolescent use. And then we're going to demonstrate an understanding on the impact marijuana can have on the youth brain development, which is a very important part of the YMPP curriculum, and a very important prevention strategy when it comes to talking about marijuana and why young people should delay the use of it. When I said earlier, some things have changed very, very quickly, right? Think it back to, I'm thinking about doing this training last year in June, and how things shifted so quickly from the shutdown in March to just getting through that the first year of COVID, and what that adjustment must have been like for young people. It was hard for me as an adult. I'm sure many of you relate to me saying that here, right? But we're going to talk a little bit about what we know so far and the impact that this pandemic may have had on mental health and the risks, the risk factors for young people that may have increased use. We don't have that data quite yet, but we're going to make some inferences based on what we know already. When it comes to the second half of the program, we're going to talk about, a little bit about. I'm going to go over the history of prevention and what we've learned, right? What works and what doesn't work, right? I'm sure those of you who've been teaching in the field for many years might have already had some experience with programs that don't work and some experience with programs that do work, right? So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about why that, learning from that history is important moving forward when having a conversation about marijuana and other drugs with young people. And then at the end, we're going to develop a plan to implement this curriculum. Again, 2020, 2021 have been unparalleled years. I'm sure you're sick of hearing that sentence, but I mean, for many people, do we have the opportunity to implement this YMPP curriculum? That is information that we would love to hear from you later on when we send out evaluations, right? Because we're going to think about, like, if you haven't had the opportunity to implement this curriculum this past year for many reasons, that's okay. It's still here. We made some new additions. We're going to talk about that later on in the training today. All right, so building the foundations, right? So today, the outline for the first half of the presentation is going to talk about the basics, like I said, trends in potency, methods of consumption, right? Many of you are familiar with vaping and how that's changed the game when it comes to cannabis or marijuana consumption. Adolescent use rates, the impact marijuana has on the developing brain, COVID and use, and then the environmental consequences of use. So not just the developmental consequences and the impact on the developing brain, but how it impacts young people, their academics, their peer relationships, and other potential pitfalls of marijuana use. All right, so I think, I use this slide in all my presentations because when it comes to marijuana, I believe that one of the biggest risk factors for young people today is misinformation. The perception that marijuana or cannabis is, because it's becoming legalized, because they hear about the potential medicinal uses, whether or not those medicinal uses have been, peer reviewed and have been researched and published on that is fact, right? When perception of risk goes down, we see this with any type of behavior, use goes up, right? Or engaging that behavior goes up. So what does that look like for cannabis? What does that look like for kids today, right? Like I said, legalization. Last time we were here, the number of states that have increased the legalization of marijuana have increased. The argument that it's all natural, right? That it comes from the ground, right? Now we know really when we get into it and we discuss that, it's actually genetically modified. It is a product. It's a billion-dollar industry, and the thing that they're selling is a high potency product, and so it's not necessarily all natural anymore, and it hasn't been for decades. It's an important conversation that's built into the curriculum. Discrete use. What do I mean by that? Well, vaping, and how vaping has made it easier to get away with using and consuming cannabis for young people. There we go. And then perceived peer use, right? We're going to talk a little bit about social norms today. When young people perceive that more people are engaging in that behavior than they actually are, that is a risk factor to young people because it makes them more likely to engage in that behavior. Medicine, right? The conversation around medical marijuana, medicine equals, okay, equals good. That's not the case for all medicine. Why does that apply to marijuana? Right? And then easier to get away with. All right. And so what do I mean by that? So I think that is new. That could be the vaping technology, discrete use. I also think that this past year has presented a challenge, or may present a challenge. Less structure, not being in a school environment from 7:20 to 3:30, every day. It presents a risk factor to young people. They don't have to be in that structured environment. Maybe it's easier for them to get away with, right? These are some things that we're making inferences, but we also know are risk factors for young people. So when those things happen, we see that use rate go up. And so as our jobs as educators, right, in the classroom, to address this misinformation and these perceptions or these false normative beliefs, to not necessarily tell young people what to do, but to inform them, to empower them to make healthier choices. Okay. So the truth about marijuana, like I said earlier, right? It's natural. That argument could be made for many substances. And I'm not, when I say tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs are similar in that regard, I'm not saying this is something when a student says, oh, marijuana is natural, it's not a big deal, that you would necessarily come back at them with this, right? That, harshly saying, like, well, so is tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs, right? I mean, it's a fact, but I think what's important to do is to, point this out to young people, say like, all right, well, what other drugs might be perceived as natural? And then what is the reality, right? Like when I talked about genetically modified cross hibernation, that this is a product that $1 billion industry is trying to produce. What is it as natural as we perceive it to be, right? Kind of guiding the conversation to engage in more critical thought, right? That's how we would approach it with young people. There's a perception that it's non-addictive, right? You'll hear young people say, yeah, but it's not physically addictive. Well, 17% of youth who use marijuana go on to develop cannabis use disorder later on in their life. So, another thing, right, is that marijuana is considered the lower risk drug when we can compare it to other illicit substances. And today, that perception is way off. When we look at the potency rates of marijuana, which I'll talk about later on, it is a completely different substance than, as educators, you may perceive it to be. As someone in recovery myself, right, who graduated in high school, right, the cannabis that I was using in 2007 is completely different than the cannabis that exists today. So it's a different conversation. And, people have this perception of marijuana, which is fine. You can have that perception, right, based on what your experience may have been, what your parents' experience may have been. But that is irrelevant to what is actually out there today and available to young people. So I think that's a very important thing to realize as an educator when it comes to this topic. So medical marijuana, like I said, the idea that this is medicine, and so that somehow lowers the risk, right? Again, I can use parallel logic and say, well, pain medication is medication, and we know, we are very familiar as a society of the risk associated with pain medication. Okay, that's a good point, right? But is it helpful when talking with a young person, right? So what we know so far is like, yes, we're hearing this, affirming that we're hearing this information that is all over the place, right? That's why, like I keep saying, misinformation is one of the number one risk factors to young people, right? They see these things, but they're not really engaging with the content critically to really know the whole picture, right? And then they take a snapshot of information and might use that information to make a choice or engage in a certain behavior that may be risky to them, right? So we are, as a society, still just beginning to understand what the medical benefits may be for marijuana. With young people, the number one thing that I hear consistently for the reason for using marijuana is it helps my anxiety. And we have in the curriculum, the YMV curriculum, ways to respond to this very common, statement made by young people or, experience shared by young people. It is not validated as a medication for anxiety, and for young people, it can actually exacerbate anxiety and prevent young people from developing the critical coping skills that they need to manage anxiety during those very important years of brain development. When we look at national, and this is from Monitoring the Future in 2020, when we look at prescription rates of medical marijuana by doctors, fewer than 2% of adolescents have been prescribed or have report being prescribed or being told to use medical cannabis by a doctor. Other things, right? When considering medical cannabis, no doctor I've ever worked with would tell any of their patients to smoke their medicine, right? Right. That is not a healthy way to ingest anything or inhale their medicine, I should say, right? We got to consider vaping as well. So just some things to think about when we think about medical marijuana. We still have a lot of ways to go. Yes, there are some validated treatments there are some illnesses that medical marijuana are validated for, but is not the cure-all substance that a lot of people claim it to be. And I think that's a very important distinction as educators to make when having the conversation with young people. All right, so here are some of the basics that I was talking about that you may be familiar with. But again, if you haven't spent the past year studying cannabis, like I don't intend any of you to be doing with your very busy schedules, with teaching virtually, with making sure that the students get the curriculum that is required of you, right? I don't intend any educator on our call today to feel like that marijuana has been their number one focus this past year. So I think it's very good to review, right? So when we look at marijuana, and you'll hear me use marijuana and cannabis as interchangeable terms, right? It has over 500 chemicals in the total, and around 100 of those are cannabinoids. There's two distinct cannabinoids that you are probably familiar with, right? And that is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, otherwise known as THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in this plant that produces the high in the user. And then there's CBD. And this is something that young people will ask about, and we're seeing more and more of. It does not produce a high. And we're seeing this cannabinoid pop up in places like Whole Foods, coffee shops. And I shouldn't even say pop up. Now we're past the stage of it popping up. It's there. It's there. It's pretty much everywhere you look, right? And it's closely connected with the cannabis plant. CBD, like I said, does not produce a high. It is, I think, it's a lot of people. There's a lot of questions around young people around that, like, can I get high off it? And there's, to quote Ben Court, I believe, right, who has done some work, be a part of the conversation, right? I could be, sitting in a CBD bubble bath, vaping on a CBD vape, drinking a CBD soda, and it is not going to have any psychoactive effects on me. There are a lot of claims, though, that it does have medical benefits. Again, one of those things being a reduce in anxiety, or there's CBD balms for pain, joint pain. There's CBD teas, everything you can think of, right? This is something that people in capitalism are trying to capitalize on and make money off of, right? Again, not a ton of research on the efficacy of a CBD balm or a tea, or CBD at your local coffee shop and the reduction of anxiety. But again, people are very interested in it and they want to know more. And so you're going to see, I imagine, young people talking about CBD, maybe even young people, because it's not a psychoactive ingredient, sharing their experience with using CBD and saying it has a positive impact on them. What I would say to that real quickly is if young people are asking in the classroom about CBD and what they believe, hey, I'm using this, should I be using this? Am I gonna test positive on a substance use, like drug screen or whatever, like, again, some of the common questions that you will see in some of the additions to the curriculum this year, right? When we talk about common questions in the script for those common questions, I always refer to say, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, right? If you're putting something into your body for a potential benefit, right? Whether that's mental health or physical health, you should talk to a medical doctor, right? So when we look at marijuana itself, the substance, a lot of people just believe it's a depressant, right? They think marijuana and they think chilled out, slowed down, the very typical archetype of a quote unquote stoner, right? And actually, what's really kind of interesting and also scary about the marijuana or the cannabis plant is that it actually falls into 3 different categories. So it's a depressant, it's a stimulant, and if you take in too much, it can be a hallucinogen. So I you know, a way you can remember this, and some of you might remember this from last year, and it's just stuck with me. I like it. It helps me remember sometimes even too when I'm doing these presentations, right? There's the two strains of cannabis, which is the indica and sativa. And if you smoke indica, you go into the couch, right? And that's the depressant. And if you use the sativa cannabis plant, um, it's a stimulant, right? And so just indica into the couch, right? And then, you can use deductive reason to say, okay, then sativa is the stimulant. Um, when cannabis becomes an hallucinogen is when oftentimes someone is experiencing THC poisoning, otherwise known as an overdose, right? Yes, you can overdose on marijuana. I will talk about this later on. And so, this is where we can see, the very scary psychoactive effects like psychosis and other, things that would be very scary to a young person to experience if they weren't expecting it, and very scary for their peers to see maybe their friend experience if they are to take in too much THC. Okay, so potency, right? So this is a dated graph, right? It only goes to 2014, but I think it does. You get the picture, right? So the cannabis plant has changed significantly. Like I said, I graduated in 2007, and it was probably lower than 8% to 13% THC. But I remember having some experiences with my own cannabis use. I'm in recovery now. I've been in recovery for over 11 years, but I remember, back then, a couple of times where I felt really uncomfortable and did not like the way I was feeling. And, when I used the flower itself, because, and that was around an 8% to 13%, potency, maybe even a little bit below that, right? Because again, 2007. But when we look at how the cannabis plant has evolved, right? And this graph doesn't show it, but 2014 marks the year that in Colorado, adult use of cannabis was legalized. And when that happened, right, again, billion-dollar industry, people trying to make a buck. The product is THC. That's the thing that is getting people. Um, that's what people are using the substance for, right? We see potency rates really, really, really start to skyrocket. You can see that in 2017, right? The average marijuana flower is around 20.6. When we look at extracts, so oils or marijuana wax around 68.7, right? That was in 2007. Now 2019, we're seeing concentrates in dispensaries up to 90% THC. Which I'll be honest is frightening. Because I think about the developing teenage brain. I think about how we know marijuana impacts the developing teenage brain, and the peer-reviewed research that we have on marijuana's impact on the developing teenage brain, and that was with THC rates nowhere near where they are today. So later on in a little bit, when I shift to talk about the developing brain, right, and the impact marijuana has on the developing brain, I want us to kind of try to think about, well, okay, that's in 2014 when THC percentages were XYZ. Again, we can make an inference that if someone is using marijuana concentrates while their brain is developing, it's going to have even a more negative consequence on their development, and we're going to see even more of an impact on areas of the brain that are traditionally impacted by cannabis. All right, so a little bit more of a history, right? THC levels in the 1960s, THCs in the 1980s, right? Average THC level today, highest potency in the marijuana flower, right? So when I say marijuana flower, that that bud you see on the left, that's what I'm talking about. And then when we look at the marijuana concentrates, all right, it kind of looks like earwax, that's what we're talking about. And usually how that's marijuana concentrates, if anyone's interested, right? How that is made, right, is they put the cannabis flower, the cannabis plant, into these steel tubes, and they heat up and sweat the plant, right? The sweat basically the THC out of the plant, And then at the long end of the steel tube, there is a hole, right? And they pressurize that tube, and what comes out is that orange, it evolves from the marijuana flower that we see at the top left of the screen, and it evolves into that orange earwax looking substance. They spread it out. They try and say, they spread it out and let the butane evaporate, but there's still butane left in the product. And then you're left with this wax, shatter, glass. There's other, slang terms for the substance itself. Right. So, when going back to that perception that marijuana is natural, it makes me think a lot of the process for making the drug cocaine, right? Where it comes from the cocoa plant, and then it goes through all of these processes to make the final the powder that looks nothing like the plant anymore in its original form. Okay. So, like I said, we have the marijuana flower, which is the dried plant. And, this is still around, still very prevalent, still very accessible, sold in dispensaries, sold not in dispensaries, right? Or states where it's not legal. The traditional, I think when people think marijuana, at least my age, and millennials and probably above, this is what I think of, right? Becoming ever more popular are marijuana edibles. It's perceived as healthier because you don't have to smoke it. It is perceived as, more fun, I guess, right? Because they come with brownies, cookies, gummy bears, everything that you can think of, lollipops. Again, brownies being the more traditional version of edibles. And then you got THC oils, right? When we think about vaping, this is the oil that goes into vaping products to a little bit higher potency than the marijuana flower itself. And then marijuana concentrates, you've now seen this image several times, right? That is up to 90% THC. By the way, I know I'm going pretty quickly. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask, Kim and anyone else, please feel free to type that into the chat, or unmute, and you won't be interrupting me. That way, your question hopefully can get answered in that moment, and then we can keep moving on. So please feel free. If you see something like, what is that? Or can you tell me a little bit more about that? I am totally okay with you pausing and asking that question. Okay. So modern day paraphernalia. So we have, those contraptions on the left side of the screen. Some of them look like water pipes, and that's because they actually are, but they're more designed for what is known as another slang term that you're going to hear, dabbing, right? And so dabbing is the verb for using marijuana concentrates. So again, that earwax looking substance. It's gross. I'm sorry. I keep calling it earwax looking substance, but I can't really compare it to anything else. It's just, that's what it looks like to me. So, in those paraphernalia that you see on the left side of your screen, right? That substance is put into that. And then, you see some of those, right in the middle there. It looks like a ice pick, if you will, that is heated up and then the marijuana wax is touched with that. And basically what is happening is that concentrate is being freebased through those products right there. So that is dabbing. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a joint, a spliff, and a blunt, right? A joint is a marijuana cigarette with strictly marijuana. A spliff includes marijuana and some tobacco, and then a blunt is a cigar, the external part of the cigar used to wrap marijuana in it. The PAX vaporizer, some of you might recognize that. It looks a lot like the Juul, right? And if we think about 2016, 2017, when we saw that skyrocketing use in vaping, the Juul was the most popular product to vape nicotine among young people. Actually, PAX Vaporizer and Juul used to be the same company, but PAX is Juul's version for cannabis, for marijuana. That piece of equipment right there is very expensive, so I wouldn't expect a lot of teens to be able to afford a 190, almost $200, vaporizer, but sometimes you do see it. So, and then the dab pen, right? Another more affordable, if you will, version of paraphernalia that is modern. Okay, so let's talk about edibles. We're seeing an increase in edible use, and with an increase in edible use and just the potency of marijuana, increasing steadily over the past, I shouldn't even say steadily, erratically, I would say, over the past decade, we're also seeing an increase in, emergency department visits, and other consequences, right? So what is it about edibles that make them unique when it comes to traditional inhaling, I guess, or consumption of marijuana? You know, Even in Colorado, they're still trying to figure out, right? It's been legal there, what now, for 7 years? Um, they're still acknowledging that they are still learning how to manage the legalization of adult use of marijuana, right? So what Colorado laws are saying are one serving of THCs is 10 milligrams. And 10 milligrams, if you don't have a tolerance for cannabis, 10 milligrams is a lot. So if someone, who is traveling to the state of Colorado, um, and I know there are many other states where this is legal, right? So, right, we can go to New York, Massachusetts, Maine, Illinois, right? New Jersey. If someone's going to a state where it's legal and they're excited to, engage, even if they are an adult, right? Engage in adult use of these substances, they don't really know what their tolerance is, right? It's not the same as one shot of alcohol equals 1.5 ounces, 5 ounces of wine, and 12 ounces equals one beer. We don't have that standard drink size, or we really haven't been able to establish that, right? So someone who might be naive or might not have a cannabis tolerance, they put 10 milligrams in their body, they're really going to feel it, right? Um, and another thing to consider, the packaging doesn't do a fantastic job of really helping you understand how much you are consuming, right? You might see a chocolate bar that says 500 milligrams or 5 milligram or 50 milligrams of THC, and then what they mean is each chocolate square is 10 milligrams. But that's not, for someone who isn't familiar with this, that's not automatically assumed or known. So what we're seeing is people often eating too much, um, you know, uh, or eating something, not realizing that it's going to take some time to their body to digest it. Whereas when you inhale something, it gets into your bloodstream and reaches your brain much quicker. Some individuals have reported before that it could take 4 hours for them to start, feeling the psychoactive effects. And so those are, when we consider mass-produced cannabis products, right? There's those risks. What about when people make it in their own, house, and there is really no way to measure the potency. To me, that is the biggest risk. And so when it comes to edibles, and so we're seeing, increased hospital visits, like I said earlier, but also increased risk for psychosis due to Thc poisoning and all of those things that occurs when someone doesn't realize how much that they're taking, right? So what is a marijuana overdose? I'll often, when I'm in a classroom with young people, I'll say, "Can you overdose on marijuana?" Um, and they usually laugh. They usually laugh when I say that because they think I'm some out of touch adult who doesn't know what they're talking about, right? And overdose has been, really when we hear the word substance use overdose, it's paired with the opioid epidemic. Um, and overdose doesn't necessarily mean fatal. Well, actually, let me kind of rephrase that. The word overdose does not mean fatal, right? We know people can fatally overdose. We've seen it in this country, unfortunately, right, with the opiate epidemic and other substances, right? Overdose means that you took over the recommended dosage, period. Right. And so, yes, you can overdose on marijuana. Right. Another way to put it, because people are so reactive to that word overdose, is THC poisoning. So I say, THC poisoning is an overdose, and overdose is THC poisoning. Um, so, one thing to consider why a marijuana overdose is not fatal is because when we look at the brain, right, and the areas of the brain that control our central nervous system, right, which is the brainstem, right, so heartbeats, blood pressure, all of those, what I usually tell young people, your breathing, all of those things that, just happen and you hope continue to happen when you go to sleep at night, right? And you wake up in the morning, right? You're not really thinking about them. That's the brainstem's responsibility. And there are no cannabidiol receptors on the brain, right? So traditionally, when you see an overdose with opioids or when you see an overdose with alcohol, right, it's because alcohol reaches the brainstem, shuts down the respiratory system. Very similar thing happens with opioids, right? The respiratory system shuts down, and that what leads to a fatal overdose. You don't have that same type of risk with cannabis. But there are people who have used cannabis, right? I'm not saying no one's ever died from ingesting cannabis, who have used cannabis, have experienced heart failure, or have experienced psychosis that have done something that ended up being fatal. So there is still that risk there. It's just not the traditional overdose that we are thinking of, or that we are familiar with, I should say. So symptoms: rapid heart rate, increasing risk of heart attack, like I mentioned, hallucinations, mental confusion, panic attacks, right? So feeling like you're dying, extreme paranoia, psychosis can be kind of similar in a way. So, these are all really unpleasant feelings, right? And usually I'll say this again, when I'm working with older kids, um, and I talk about, like, I ask the question, can you overdose? Right? And they say no. I'm like, okay, well, like, what does overdose mean? I break down the word overdose. I start to read these symptoms, and you'll see it, right? You'll see the kids look at each other across the room. Some of them make eye contact, like, oh, that happened to, that's what happened, right? To me when, or to, like, to our, whoever they might be thinking of, a common person, right? So they've seen this, right? And so now I've just given them language to identify what actually happened to their friend that didn't really have a good time when they used cannabis, right? Um, when we're going to look at, adolescent use rates. I always youth and use, it's hard, two hard words to to say right in a row. But when we're going to look at adolescent use rates in a moment, and uh, you know the majority of young people don't use cannabis. Um, and then we're going to look at those who do and how we can have a prevention conversation with them. But we also have the 30% of cannabis users, right? People that, use cannabis the first time, choose not to use it again, right? And, I was watching a training earlier from Stanford Cannabis Prevention Toolkit. They an amazing tool, which I think all you as educators should be aware of, that you can use in addition to what MPP curriculum. I was watching a training, and the trainer said, "Thank God for those individuals that use cannabis once." And the best thing that can happen to them is they don't like how it makes them feel, right? And they don't ever want to use it again. Right? And not only do adolescents experience that, I have many adult friends who feel that way about cannabis as well. All right. So vaping, right? And so now we're going, like, we talked about edibles, we talked about dabbing and wax. So vaping, a refresher, right? I feel like, we did a really great job. Um, and we learned our lessons from history when Juul use started to skyrocket in the United States. I was working and doing prevention all over the place, and I think we really did a great job as educators. Like, we've seen this before, right? Of jumping right on it, right? So this might be some review for those of you who were able to access resources when vaping became such an issue in schools, right? So what happens is that THC oil is, this product, right? Again, that is the PAX vaporizer. They look many different ways. But this, this product heats up the THC oil, it becomes an aerosol, right? It's not water vapor. It's heating up that oil. It becomes an aerosol, which actually aerosol is finer than smoke, right? Is inhaled. Individuals experience intoxication within several minutes, right? This happens because it is inhaled. It is inhaled through their lungs and gets into their bloodstream much quicker than an edible would. Effects can last 30 minutes up to several hours. The potency, right? There's not one standard, right? It's different for, whatever THC oil that you are using. And then the common misconception, right? Well, it's healthier than smoking. That really switched, I would say, in 2020, once we started to educate young people about the risk associated with vaping. It went from 2016, 2017, but it's healthier. I'm hearing it's healthier. It's only water vapor, to wait. I actually think, and I was hearing this from young people themselves, like they're saying, I actually think smoking might be healthier. We don't know yet. We're still learning, right? I think, they might not be wrong, but I can't really give you conclusive evidence that one or the other is healthier. I wouldn't say healthier, right? I would say they both present, similar and also different risks to our developing brain, our lungs, and our overall wellness. But that really happened, I think, in the beginning of the end of 2019, when we started to see those vaping hospitalizations. We have a short-term memory, right, and everything that's happened, right, in 2020. In 2021, at the end of 2019, we saw all those hospitalizations, which, due to vaping. That wasn't marijuana, that was nicotine. But I think that really, those instances really shifted the perception of risk associated with vaping as a modality or a medium for nicotine or marijuana use. All right. So the marijuana concentrates, yes, here it is, the earwax again. So it is heated with and freebase, almost like I talked about earlier, right? That ice picking device that you then touch the wax with, it turns into a smoke, and then that smoke is inhaled. And that is not, when I say freebase, I think, let me just clarify, right? Because I think it's important, because I don't want y'all to think when I hear freebase, I think substances like crack cocaine, which is you see a lighter and a piece of tinfoil. It's not like that, right? It's more advanced, if you will. I guess I don't think it's advanced at all, but it's a little bit more costly, I guess, at least with the paraphernalia being expensive as they are. It is usually, like I said, those, going back to that picture of that paraphernalia used with a water pipe. Not a piece of tinfoil and a lighter, right? So it's that, it's heated and then inhaled. It's similar to freebasing, but I wouldn't say it's exactly freebasing, the way that we are very familiar with. Very fast delivery, right? Almost instantly. People start to feel the effects when they are using marijuana concentrates. Potency, huge risk factor right there. And then, it's the method is most associated with emergency room visits, right? So I would say concentrates and edibles are what we see in terms of when you talk to individuals that work in emergency departments. This is what they're seeing. All right. So these numbers, you might notice, for those of you who were with us last year, are the same as they were last year, because we don't have new monitoring the future data, because, I think it's escaping me right now. I think it is annual. Kim, it is an annual. Yeah. There's a lot of different surveys. The pay survey is biannual, but we weren't able to do it this year because of COVID-19. And so these numbers actually, right, I put a little asterisk. So these are the same numbers that we saw last year for those who joined us last year. These were collected really before the shutdown. And Monitoring the Future, even, in the report said, we weren't able to collect, as many surveys as we typically could, because, the COVID-19 shutdown happened while they were administering these surveys. So this is right under about 12,000 students nationwide, I think is what these percentages represent. So, annual use 35.7% for 12th graders, 28.8% for 10th graders, 11.8% for 8th graders. And then, 30-day use, we see the numbers decrease. But I want to point out something that's, I think, is super important, and that I will touch on later on in our part two of the training today, right? 22.3%, that's, almost 1 in 5. No, sorry, that is more than 1. Math. That is, right, that's a significant amount of the young people that you're talking to. Let's put it that way, instead of turning, percentages into fractions, which math was never my strong suit. But, um, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. The good news is that, what these numbers say, and we're going to talk about social norms, the majority of young people aren't using substances, but there is a loud minority of young people, right, who we typically hear about in the lunchroom, or that you might be familiar with, right, because, um, you know, engaging in risky behavior, the loud parties, the students who get in trouble, right? That is more exciting to talk about than the students who are, you know, ordering a pizza Friday night, watching the latest, teen drama, going to soccer practice, doing their homework, and living a normal teen life. We hear more about these young people, and their peers hear more about these young people than the majority of students making healthy choices. But these kids who are engaging in use, they're not bad kids. They're just making an unhealthy choice, right? And I think when we think about prevention, it's super important that we also consider these young people in that conversation. So I'm going to talk about in a moment um, how to approach the prevention conversation, um, and it's the same way that we would approach primary prevention, which is engaging young people, listening to them, affirming them, acknowledging the reality, right, of the situation, knowing that they are the expert on what they perceive to be happening in their experience, and then providing them with additional information and education. So I'll talk about that later on, but I think these numbers are important. Main takeaway, right, is that the majority of young people are making healthy choices when it comes to cannabis use. And I think that needs to be said over and over and over again. Okay, here's the 2019 PACE data, right? So this is when we compare it, right? If you look real quickly, Montgomery County has some higher numbers than the 2020 national numbers. So, and really, when it comes to, I think, 12th grade, right? Those numbers are higher. So I'm sorry if I'm flicking back and forth, but I can't, And then when we look at 30-day use as well, 12th grade is higher. All right. So what is happening? I think this is what is happening between 10th and 12th grade for Montgomery County students. Y'all might have a better idea of what that might be than I would as individuals, right? Working with these young people, 9 months out of the year daily. But I think that's a good question to ask ourselves, right? What's shifting in their lives that are, we're seeing these increases at the rate that we are. And when we compare this to national numbers, why are they higher? All right. My favorite part of being an educator when it comes to prevention is talking about the brain, because I think, and based on my experience, that this is the topic. It's not, we're talking about substances, but we're not talking about substances, right? We're talking about marijuana and its impact, but we're not, right? And kids are so interested to learn about the brain. And I wish we had more information to give them, but I think as a society and in the medical field, we're just really starting to understand all, like, the brain itself, right? But I think it's super important to say, like, that for the young people, the biggest risk that they engage in when they use alcohol, marijuana, or other substances is that the impact it has on their brain, right? So when we look at the brain, Most up-to-date research says that the brain does not finish developing until the mid-20s. Again, what I said earlier, right? We're just starting to scratch the surface. That's what I believe as an educator on how we understand the brain. I've heard research that says 32, right? Which I turned 32 this year, so hopefully that's the case, right? Um, you know, other things I've said, and you might see this, right? There's this, um, you know, conversation around individuals designated female at birth, their brains finishing development earlier than individuals designated male at birth. So we see maturity differences there. Maybe that's biological, maybe that's societal. That's another conversation for another time, right? But something to consider. The experience for individuals designated female at birth is different for the individuals designated male at birth. The last area of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is a really important part of the brain, right? That allows people to weigh risk versus reward, decision making, evaluate consequence. And so I love this analogy. Kim's heard me say it before. You might remember this from last year, right? But for teenagers, what we need to consider as educators, right? When we look at the midbrain, which is impulse driven, which is what feels good, pleasure driven, and then we look at the prefrontal cortex again, weighs risk versus reward, and says makes is responsible for critical thoughts. We got a Ferrari engine, bicycle brakes, right? So young people basically sometimes make decisions based on what might feel good, what's going to give them social cred, what's going to, what is directly in front of them, what feels good versus like what might have long-term consequences, right? So it's really important that we kind of bring this point out to young people and their parents and educators, right? Because it can be really frustrating when we're trying to work with certain individuals and like they're not quite, getting what's going on here, right? So this is what puts young people at a higher risk to make unhealthy choices, right? Especially when they're feeling the pressure from peers, right? Or they really just see one piece of misinformation that they base their decision off of and they don't do the research or they don't have the education, right? Which is our responsibility to make sure that we actually provide a space to give them that information to help inform that choice, right? To get those gears turning in that prefrontal cortex.
Katie,
Yeah,
can I
go
ask you a
ahead.
question? Can you go back to that slide for a moment? So I think what's so important is that we understand this piece. It's like you said, it's so vital. And I know you talk to young people a lot about this. One thing that I've heard some other prevention specialists say is this is great for us as adults to understand, but to tell a teenager, oh, your brain's not fully developed yet. It feels very insulting. And they suggested maybe turning it around and saying, you have such an opportunity to develop your brain in a healthy way because it's still growing. It's still, like just to kind of be thoughtful about how we tell young people about this vulnerability, but to treat it more as an opportunity to give it healthy coping mechanisms and not those risk factors.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Kim. Like, absolutely, I 100% agree with that, right? Like, it could come across as very condescending to say, like, look, your brain is, you know, you don't know what you're doing because you're not developed. That's the last. Okay, it's the last thing a young person wants to hear, right? I understand what my mom was telling me now, right? What she said, like, believe me, you don't want to grow up too fast, right? But when you're 16, that's all you want, right? So that's the last thing you absolutely want to hear. How I usually phrase it is, and I look at it as an opportunity, and I really try to drive that point home. I say, between the ages of 15 and 21, your brain is on fire, right? What I mean by that is every book that you read, every social interaction that you have, prom, that test you take, your brain is taking that in and it's creating a blueprint for who you are going to become, right? And that blueprint is meant to be developed without the presence of marijuana, alcohol, or other drugs, right? When we start to put alcohol or other drugs, right, in there, it starts hardwiring things that are not meant to be, right? And that's really what the risk is. Another analogy that you can use with younger kiddos is baking brownies, right? And I love this one. Hey, and I engage them like, all right, we got brownies, we got the Betty Crocker mix, we got those 2 eggs, we got that vegetable oil, right? And I say, okay, how does this go? How does this work? And usually the kids will start to yell out, right? Like, hey, all right, you put the mix into the bowl, and then you put crack the eggs, right? I'm like, all right, but what about this salt over here, right? And I started taking, I said, I'm gonna pour in all of this salt, right? And the kids usually go, no, 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 right? Like, why? I'm gonna, I bake the brownies, I put them in, right? I got the brownies that I made based on the ingredients, right? Based on the instructions on the box. And I got the brownies that I took the salt, and I just dumped the salt in, right? They're gonna look the same, right? But one's gonna taste very different. And for younger kiddos, right, that helps them kind of like that visual representation or that symbolism really helps them grasp, like, okay, like my brain is developing right now, and I'm going through the normal developmental process. Um, if I put something into my brain that is not meant to be there in this process, it's going to have a long-lasting impact, right? So that's really the goal that we want to drive home. I think it's super important, like you said, just to flip it around, and not make to make it not condescending, and say like, look, we got an opportunity here. The brain's an amazing organ. There's a reason why you get up, you're in school by 7:20, you have, 7 hours of instruction, then you go on to your athletics, then you go your homework, and then you do it all over again 5 days a week, right? Because your brains can handle that, because they're at this developmental stage, and we want your brain to develop into the beautiful organ that is intended to be. Alcohol or the drugs have a huge impact on that. I find that very powerful, and yeah, I mean, and that I think also can like we can that approach is kind of highlighted in the curriculum, like how we have the conversation, and it's like really just a way we can like make these young people feel like equals in the conversation,
Great tip
when we're
and
talking about these topics.
great tip in the chat. Shannon shared. She likes to say, if you feed a plant Doritos and soda, will it grow up healthy? That's good.
Yeah, probably not. Um, okay. Other impacts of marijuana on the brain, um, is IQ points. I'm not gonna read everything, right? Just so we can make sure we get to the break in time and make sure everyone has their they don't have to listen to me talk for 3 hours completely straight, right? But one of the effective prevention strategies that I'm going to talk about in the second half. Um, we know, and this isn't news to anybody, right? We know scare tactics don't work. Why am I talking about this on one of the brain slides? Well, a lot of the young people that I talk about, when you ask them what's important to them, a lot of them, not everyone, so that's important to say also, but a lot of them say academics, right? And based on the research that we have, right, that marijuana, cannabis during youth, if an individual engages in youth use of marijuana, we've been able to identify that the potential risk for decreasing IQ points significantly by 8 points, right? A lot of young kids hear that and like, wow, what? A lot of young kids, they're like, all right, whatever. That doesn't, mean anything to me, right? Not every prevention approach is going to hit every kid in the same way. But how do we make this relevant, right? I always say when it comes to other impacts marijuana has in the brain, memory and motivation, all those other things, right? This could be the difference between, for those kids who are really academic focused, this could be the difference between the, score on a standardized test that gets you into your dream school versus, your other schools that you're applying to. And not that that should be like the main focus or that would be the end of the world. At 16, though, it's for a 16-year-old who's very academically driven, and that's very important to them. That's a consequence that is relevant. So, Kim, I saw you
We
raise
have
your
a
hand. Yeah.
question. We have a question on this before we move on. Someone asked, I find this info difficult to convey to kids. 8 points doesn't seem like a lot to them, so it's not a real threat. When do most kids even know their IQ?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, like I said, I don't think, these are, for some young kids who are athletes, it might be the education on lung health, right? For those of who, who are not athletic and academics is what they got, this might be the thing that reaches them. It might not be athletics or academics. It might be the social consequences of substance use, right? When we look at um, the impact it can have on relationships, that really might affect young people who value their friendships over anything else. So it's I think, and when we look at IQ, right, you're right. Like, I don't know what my IQ is. There are some people that I know that do, right? That whatever for when they're younger, they when the gifted programs, they know their IQ, right? So this would be very significant to them. But it's not gonna mean something to everybody, right? So I think when we're thinking about the large picture, it's like we introduce all of these pieces of information, right? Um, and for some kiddos, some things are going to stick and be more significant than other things. I think what thing might help scaling an IQ like 8 points is just to give the range of what IQ, like what the standard ranges of someone's IQ are and how they are perceived or measured, in society. That might also be helpful, but I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, and Susan,
Thank you, Kim.
she likes to kind of, make a joke about it by saying, I don't know about you, but I really can't spare any IQ points, and then gets a bit more serious to say that they can make a difference on SAT scores, difference between an A and a B on a test, to kind of give it some context.
Yeah.
And there was a question too about does the IQ rebound with discontinued use? Believe the study showed that it does not necessarily, that it might be permanent, correct?
Yeah, no, so this is like a measure of so this is like one of the long-term consequences of use when we look at this specific study. Is it followed a cohort of individuals. And so when we look at short-term impacts, which I'm going to go into the 4Ms later on, which some of you might be familiar with, it's just also part of the curriculum. Marijuana typically takes, it can take 30 or more days to get out of the system. And sometimes, I've been doing prevention now for several years, but I started in treatment and I saw this myself. And I'll talk about it in a moment, but you will see some of those consequences that I'm going to talk about in a moment start to people start to, as the physical substance leaves their body, you kind of see the lights go back on in the house and you see them, speaking more clearly, remembering things easily. And so, but this is a long-term consequence that I don't think rebounds. Yeah. Okay, here they are. 4Ms. And I make a joke, a lot of, I have the luxury in my, and this is not how the YMP curriculum is designed, but I have a luxury through my education that I do through Prevention Education Solutions of delivering a lot of this content through my own personal experience, right? So I think I have one of my negative consequences that I often share with the kiddos is, I think my marijuana use did impact my, memory and motivation, my maturity, motor skills. And usually, honestly, I have a difficult time remembering all the 4Ms, even though it should be pretty easy, right? So when we think about the 4Ms of marijuana, right? Motivation, maturity, motor skills, and memory. These are some of the immediate impacts we start to see when someone becomes a more regular marijuana user. So I want to kind of just, again, the young people and this is a part of the curriculum at the high school level. And so part of me kind of going through this now for you with the hopes of y'all will be able to use the YMPP curriculum in 2021-2022 school year is modeling a way that you could present this information. Right, so this is a neuron, this is a brain cell, right? And so when we think about motor skills, when we think about memory, I think this is a great way to articulate the impact THC impacts those things, right? So, we have two parts. We're not going to do a full biology level here. I don't think I could, honestly, but I do know the two parts that are really important to drive home the point here, right? We got the axon, and we got the myelin sheath, right? So the myelin sheath is fat. It protects the axon. It insulates the axon, right? I want you to think of like, you have your rubber cord, your power cord, right? And you have the wire that is plugging and carrying the electricity into my computer right now. And then that's the axon. And then you have the rubber insulation that is allowing that wire to do its job the way it's intended to deliver that energy into my computer, right? So that's the axon, that's the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is made of fat. What we know about cannabis, THC, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, it is fat soluble. So it is stored in the fat cells. Typically what I hear is up to 30 days it can be stored after someone engages in use of cannabis. You can test positive for THC for up to 30 days afterwards. For heavy cannabis users, I've seen 45 days, I've seen 50 days. And what that looks like, right, when you're giving someone a urine drug screen sample is, fat is excreted through urine, and that's where we test, test positive if they're a cannabis user, right? So I've seen someone who's been using marijuana for 5 years every day, right, that takes a lot of time to get out of their system. So what does this mean, right? We got this, so much of our brain is covered in fat, right? And so when someone uses delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, aka THC, and they start to engage in use repetitively, right? It gets stored in the fat cells all over the body. Now, what does this do? This significantly lowers those messages that are being sent through the axon, right? So what is memory? Memory, by definition, is the ability to store and learn new information, okay? Right? Let's think about a cannabis user. And I can only use myself as an example when I was in high school. Right? I used to be that A student, studies, didn't read the chapter, takes 45 minutes, makes an outline, studies it, gets an A. No big deal next day. I started to use marijuana. And at first I wasn't really seeing those consequences, right? I was using once on the weekend, maybe a couple times a month my freshman year, and then my substance use progressed as addiction does. And my ability to store and learn new information was decreased, right? So, I wasn't reading the chapters, I was studying, but instead of getting that A I was used to, I started to get the Bs. I wasn't retaining the information. My reading comprehension was impaired, right? All of these things that my brain was intended to work a certain way, but now the function of this is being disrupted because of the concentrated THC in the fat cells in the myelin sheath, slowing those messages down. Another impact, right, when we think about this model, motor skills, okay? Right, and so remember, you don't have to be high to experience these negative consequences. These consequences continue to happen when an individual is not experiencing the psychoactive effects, right? As marijuana continues to build up in their system, as they become a heavier cannabis user, these consequences are, continue to build up, right? So I played lacrosse, I skateboarded, I played soccer. My motor skills were impacted, right? Like I'm dribbling the ball down the field, I'm not getting the assist to my teammate to score the goal. They're sending me the assist, and my motor skills are delayed significantly compared to what I was used to. My athletic skills start to decline. Not to mention, right, what does that do to your motivation? That's separately from marijuana's impact itself on motivation. But when you practice something and you're not getting any better of it, or your skills are decreasing when you're studying, right, and you're not, getting the scores that you're used to, that does not feel really good, right? And so I break this down for students. And you all have might seen this in students that you've worked with over the year. You see an A student, you see the shift happens, right, when they start to engage in use of cannabis. This is not, and when I tell this to young people, they start nodding their heads and they go, and they're thinking of their friend that they've seen this happen to, right? And so this gives them the why, right? So I always say it's super, super important, right, that we give young people reasons why they want to delay use, right? Again, the developing brain is a great reason why once young people have this information, for them to make a healthier choice moving forward. Okay. Other impacts that marijuana has in the brain is hypothalamus, right, which regulates food intake, right? So it actually enlarges the hypothalamus. So when you hear the munchies, this is what happens. THC affects the cerebellum, right, which is managing coordination, and it overstimulates the amygdala. So this is one of the reasons why cannabis impacts motivation. So when it overstimulates and overstimulates and overstimulates the amygdala, the things that typically stimulated the amygdala that weren't cannabis, right? That were my skateboarding, or that were, for another student debate club, or that were, other natural behaviors that used to give students natural highs are no longer doing that anymore, because they really can't compete with the artificial stimulation that occurs due to cannabis, right? So this is that motivation, right? I remember an adult in my life when I was younger used to say marijuana is the great unmotivator, and they weren't wrong, but I didn't know what that meant. Like, I'm like, okay, why though? And I didn't even ask the question why. I just said, okay, like, thanks for that piece. But again, really, when we talk about those 4Ms, let's give students the information of why that happens, right? And I promise you, they're interested to know. They love talking about the brain. Okay. A little bit more, right? So THC alters the function of the hippocampus. I love to compare the hippocampus, right, as like the save button on your computer, right? If and the pain. I don't think it really happens to students anymore, right? But I'll talk about that, right? The pain of not pressing save and losing your paper, right? You know, THC impacts the function of the hippocampus. I also sometimes, when I'm talking about alcohol and educating students on what happens during a blackout, right? It's your brain. What happens is the alcohol impacts the hippocampus, and it impacts your brain's ability to press that save button, aka the hippocampus, and then therefore that's why an individual experiences a blackout. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex than that, but letting them understand what the function of that area of the brain does, and that it's impacted by the substance use, and this is why you experience X, Y, Z. And then, similarly to marijuana impacting the amygdala, it disrupts the brain reward system, and over long-term use can impact someone's response to pleasure rewarding, typically pleasure rewarding, behaviors that feel good, right, that are pleasure rewarding. Okay. So we got about 15 minutes until our break, just so everyone knows. But I want to talk about something that, like I said earlier when I first started, we don't have all the answers yet, but I think it's super important for us to consider. These past, 15 to 18 months have been really difficult. And as the pandemic starts to wind down, right, I think, and I can speak to only my personal experience, like the pandemic, I'm just beginning to understand, right? I knew it was impacting me, but I'm just beginning to really understand and comprehend its impact on me when I look at my own mental health, right? But it's definitely impacted youth. And we don't have all the information yet, but I think we can make an educated guess that it will have had an impact on substance use and mental health more generally. So when I talk about prevention, right, and again, I'll say this later on, it's about intervening on unhealthy behaviors, reducing risk, and nurturing protective factors. And one thing to consider when it comes to, something that happened during the pandemic was a lot of young people's protective factors were taken away from them, right? And that's one of my biggest concerns when we look at the potential increase of substance use. Again, I am keeping my eyes peeled for any data that we have that starts to really outline what actually has happened and what the consequences are of this when it comes to youth. And I have a little bit of that data to share with you now, but just some things to consider, right? Um, for some young people, right, school closings, like school was their like access to mental health screening and access to mental health support. Um, think about, I shared a little bit about like, hey, yeah, the pandemic definitely impacted me. I don't feel any shame in sharing that. I think everyone can relate to that, right? But let's think about the impact, right, as parents and caregivers had on individuals who are adults and what the trickle down effects may have been for the young people in their lives, right? We're talking about financial stress, uncertainty, increases in anxiety. We're humans, and this is again something that we've never experienced before. And how did we handle that? And how did that impact young people, right? Even if the young people are healthy, what is the impact of seeing your parents stressed out, or what is the impact of seeing, the person who's supposed to take care of you really struggle, right? We know in psychology, like the impact when a young person steps into a caregiving role, it can really impact a relationship and have long-lasting impacts on mental health. So just something to consider, right? Isolation from friends. In my experience as an educator and as a addictions counselor, isolation, big red flag, right, when it comes to substance use. Lack of structure. I was talking about that earlier, right? How that could have impacted. Um, Increased time in an unhealthy environment. And what I mean by that is that's not everyone's experience, but this applies to youth who might be living in abusive homes, right? Who their respite is school, right? Get up and look forward to going to school every day. Higher ACE scores that may have occurred, right? Adverse childhood experiences. We have time and time again been able to, make the correlation, or at this point, I think I can say causation, right? That a higher ACE score is a significant risk factor for increased substance use. So I think those are important things, again, just to consider. Right. So when we look at the data that we have, this is what I was referencing earlier. So the JED Foundation, which has been who developed and surveyed individuals nationally on the impact the pandemic was having on their mental health, and so this was youth, right? And so just so you know, this survey measures ages 2 to 18, and then they have a college survey that also measures the mental health during the pandemic for college students, which I've become familiar with as well, right? So the first two bullet points, they're asterisks because this is the parents' perception of their children, right? So 6 in 10 parents report that their children have experienced mental health or emotional health challenges in the past month. 3 in 10 parents report that their children's mental health is now worse than before the COVID pandemic. And then there's this image below that focuses on that. And so again, that's ages 2 to 18. That's the parents' perception of the youth in their life that they take care of, or their children. But when it comes to teenagers who were able to self-report, right, so that's 13 to 18, half of teens report that they experienced mental or emotional health challenges in the past month, most commonly anxiety, trouble concentrating, and social isolation and loneliness. Side note, it's sort of relevant, not relevant. I worked with Montgomery County to produce a similar survey for college-age individuals. And out of everyone that took the survey, when we asked the question, have you, and so 18 to and older, right? When we asked the question, have you experienced symptoms of anxiety in the past 12 months? 100% of individuals answered yes. I would be really interested, I don't have that data, but we know anxiety and depression have significantly increased during this pandemic. And I think what we're going to find out later on is the correlation between those increased symptoms and potentially using cannabis and other substances as a coping mechanism. Okay. So, let's see right here. Okay. So like I said, half of teens ages 13 to 18 reported that they've experienced mental health or emotional challenges in the past 12 months. When it comes to substance use, right? 4% reported substance use issues. Again, so this is young people reporting substance use issues. The question I have, right, as an educator and understanding the limits of a survey is how many of them perceive their substance use as an issue, right? As someone, a prevention specialist, knowing what the risks are associated with teen substance use, I perceive any substance use among young people as a potential risk. So just something to be considerate of. Do they perceive it as risky? Do we have all the information yet about the correlation between this increase of mental health symptoms and substance use? No, not yet. I will be, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe Kim, you can chime in here. What the plan is for monitoring the future for the 2021, if you know, right, 2022 school year. But I am again. Really, I will be really interested to see what those numbers are when it comes to substance use and measuring substance use within the past 12 months. Because what we're going to see is, for those young people who started to use substances to cope, when things reopen, it's not like their substance use, so for some, right, the substance use may decrease. For some, the substance use might increase, right? But knowing what we know and how the teenage brain is so much more vulnerable to addiction, for those who use cannabis as a coping mechanism to get through this pandemic, I think we're going to see continued use as a result of the pandemic. And so we, as educators, right, we, need to prepare ourselves to be ready to deal with the mental health and substance use as we look forward to the 2021-2022 school year, and being back in full person and having more of a pulse on what's going on in these young people's lives, we're going to see those consequences, I think, moving forward. That is my inference, based on how I understand, the data so far and what I know about stress being, the number one reason why so many young people report using cannabis and other substances. Okay. So higher rates of, like I said, higher rates of stress and anxiety reported. So many young people say, stress is why I use cannabis. It helps me unwind. It helps me relax. Like I said, the risk there is that when young people whose brains are still developing, and again, ages 15 to 21, the most important developmental years of their life when it comes to brain development, when they start to rely on substances, they don't develop those skills that they need to manage, stress as they continue to mature, right? And so that is why that's such a risk factor. So lack of coping skills equals increased likelihood of using substances. So when I talked about for many young people, one of the negative consequences of the pandemic that scare me the most, right, is those who their athletics were taken away, their friendships where they get support were taken away. Like when all of those things were taken away, those protective factors, for many young people, those protective factors were keeping them healthy. Now that they didn't have them, are we going to see an uptick in cannabis use? Potentially, right? Again, the issue here is, like as you see the title, it's to be determined. We don't have all the data yet. Another reason why young people report using cannabis and other substances is boredom, right? And again, reflecting back on the past year, I can definitely relate to experiencing boredom sometimes. Right, Kim, do you have anything to say?
No, this is great. I mean, the one thing I will chime in on, because my interaction is primarily with family members. Parents are absolutely seeing an increase. I mean, this is completely anecdotal. I don't have any kind of, real true data, but I can just tell you that, it's pervasive. Cannabis use is pervasive among the parents of young teens, that I'm hearing from. So, and the amotivational is really becoming a problem because they don't see that the kid themselves doesn't see it as an issue. And I'm also hearing from our clinical advisor, Mike Blanche, who has a new adolescent program that he's having a challenge because kids don't want to stop using. Their family wants them to go to treatment for they're having all this depression and anxiety, but they're using cannabis, and so he can't really engage with them, and they can't participate in a program that's based on abstinence, and so there are a lot of challenges out there for sure. And there are
Yeah,
parents who are
and it's
pretty devoted to this substance as well and not seeing it as a problem.
yeah, and thinking about that, right? Like when we, we have data saying that alcohol use sales have skyrocketed during the pandemic, right? What about adult cannabis use, right? And how young people, when we, it's definitely a risk factor when young people see the adults in their life using and consuming cannabis, and then it's in the house with them as well. Again, anecdotal, we can't really nail it down and say this is exactly what it is, but based on what we're seeing and our history as clinicians of what we're familiar with, like there's definitely some cause for concern.
And
Um,
I think there's also
and yeah,
I'm sorry, there's also the question of exposure. So parents had a lot more exposure to their kids this year if the parents themselves were working from home and the kids were learning virtually. So I'm not sure how much educators were able to observe, but the parents, we've been talking about like how the cover's been ripped off of a lot of substance use, for family members, spouses, everything, has been shifting because of the much more intense cohabitation that's been going on.
yeah, and so and that's for and I know you and I talked about this before. For these things finally to come to the surface, they need to be dealt with, right? And so like I think we're going to see two different camps, right, for young people who are at risk when those numbers, when I talk about the 22% of 12th graders who've been using, right, one of the oftentimes, and I just want to make sure um, we're going to pause here because in a moment, and then we'll pick up again. But I think, you know, as we shift this part two of the training today, um, you know, oftentimes the first negative consequence a young person experiences is getting caught, right? And that has occurred a lot more now that they are, by their parents. Now that like you said, they're learning from home, or they have been learning from home, and parents have been working from home. So but we will get to that in a moment. Um, I have some slides. It is, I guess my clock's saying 9:30. It is 9:30. I want to honor that we are going to give you all a 15-minute break, and then at 9:45 we'll come back and we'll pick up here, and we'll talk about some of those environmental consequences that young people experience. So I will stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and I will see you all back here at 9:45. Brief moment to just to go over a couple of things, right? So we're going to review the curriculum, or we're going to review like a little bit of the curriculum towards the end of our session today. We got about an hour and 15 minutes left of our training. Just so you know, the updated handbook, the curriculum, the recording of today's presentation, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that I am using today will all be made available to you starting Monday, the 28th, at conversation.zone/need to know. Kim, did I get that right?
Yes,
Great.
I did that earlier, but I'll drop it in again. The video will actually be there tomorrow. I can have that on there, but the rest of the materials Monday.
Yeah, as well as for those of you who want to receive your Act 48 credits, the link to that evaluation. So please, if you want to receive those credits, please make sure you take that evaluation. And to access this curriculum, which we'll review in a moment, you can do so at that website, right? So conversation.zone/need to know, and Kim's going to drop it into the chat, and it will be made available to you in follow-up information after today's presentation as well. All right. Oops, not from the beginning, excuse me. Okay. So, I apologize. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. So in a moment, I'm gonna have everyone break out into breakout groups. Where I'm gonna ask you a series of questions, and I'll get to that in a second. But I wanted to take a moment to have Susan Shelton share her experience as an educator who has provided a lot of prevention education for Montgomery County and her district specifically. So I'm going to invite Susan just to I provided Susan some of these questions prior to, right, because these are the questions that I'm going to have you all kind of share your experience and relate to during the breakout conversation, because I think what we're going to find, hopefully, is that there's a lot of there's a shared experience of being intimidated on this topic, and I think you're not alone in that. And so I want to, if we could, Susan, could you just share your experience talking about cannabis prevention, and then when you're done, I will set up breakout rooms for everyone to go into to answer those 4 questions that I will send out to each breakout room in a moment. So, Susan. You are muted, Susan.
Okay, sorry. So my experience may be different from many of you who are classroom teachers and you're with your students all day. I do drug and alcohol prevention, both in the community and in a school district. And I'm often invited into classrooms to talk to students, mainly about vaping, but when you talk about vaping, I always talk about marijuana as well. And I find that when I'm talking in a classroom, it's very different than when I'm talking in the community or in a smaller group with students. But in the classroom, I find students to be very quiet and very hesitant to engage. And I feel sometimes it's because I'm not their classroom teacher and I don't have that established rapport with them. And sometimes I think they're kind of shy about asking questions in front of their peers and even in front of their classroom teacher. I think sometimes they feel that maybe they're going to get in trouble if their teachers think that maybe they're using. But even though they're quiet in the classroom, I can tell by their facial expressions, and that was harder this year during the pandemic, but you can see their eyes widen at certain parts, and you can see their facial expressions that they are taking in the information. I always do have some students who, as soon as they hear what the topic is, they put their head on the desk and they tune out. And so that's always a challenge, how to reach those students. I do try to start out the very beginning of the class by telling them that I'm not here to lecture them or to tell them what to do or what not to do, but just to give them good scientific information. And I always have my sources and tell them that I use the CDC, the National Institute of Health, but I'm really just using scientific information and show them my sources on my slides. But when I ask them always at the beginning, how many people your age do you think are vaping or are using marijuana? And I have them write that down. And when we're doing it virtually, I would use like the Mentimeter. And then they can see that their numbers are way higher. They think that it's something everyone's doing. And then I share the percentage, very similar to what Katie did. So if it's 27%, I tell them 83% of you are not using marijuana. And you can see their eyes that they're very surprised by that information. Usually the students do not ask questions. If you can get a few of them to do that, then more will join in. But you will have some classes where the kids don't talk at all, other classes where they will. But always at the end, I will ask them to write down a question they had. And I tell them I can always answer the questions and give them to their teachers or come back for more discussion. But they always write thoughtful questions, intelligent questions, and it's something that they're thinking about and that they're really curious about. And that's the number one thing kids will say, is that they feel it helps them with stress. They have this idea that it's a medicine. That's not the second question kids always ask. Well, isn't this good for us? Isn't it a medicine? So I do try to say when I go into classrooms right up front, I know you're hearing all about legalization, but keep in mind that legalization has nothing to do with teenagers. All of you are teenagers. All of the legalization is about adult use. So it's not something at all for teens. So we put that out there, but the kids in general are not getting that message. They're getting the message that, hey, marijuana is legal, it's becoming legal, and it's good for you. It relieves your stress. It's a medicine. So how could that be bad for you? That's something that I hear a lot of. The other thing that kids will say is that they want to learn a lot more about marijuana, and that they feel in their classrooms that it's kind of being glossed over, or they're maybe just having a day to talk about it, and that they sense some embarrassment from their teachers as well. So that's part of what we're trying to do with the Youth Marijuana Project, is to make sure that all teachers are comfortable with this topic, and that's what we're hoping to do. And I'm not sure if I said this already, but I also ask kids at the end of the lesson to write down anything they heard that resounded with them, or would give them a pause for using a substance. And it's always what they write down has to do with the brain. So they seem to be thankful for the information about brain development, and they always will write that down about, I don't want to harm my brain, and I didn't realize that this could impact my brain. So that's just a little of my experience of talking to students. And is there anything else you wanted me to share, Katie?
No, Susan, I think it's so valuable, and I really appreciate you agreeing to share your experience, because I moved back to Pennsylvania 2019, right before the shutdown. So I really haven't been able to get into Montgomery County schools, and you're doing incredible work. And I think just your perspective and the trends that you see, and like the real like feedback you get from students in Montgomery County is really insightful and helpful. So I really appreciate you sharing your experience and taking the time to do so. So thank you very much.
I did leave out one little bit of information. Sometimes I will have a student say, your information's different than what I read about. So I will ask them, where are you getting your information? And a lot of the kids go to the internet for their information. And it's really easy to pull information up on vaping that comes from a vaping website. And they don't even realize that might not be the most accurate place to get their information. So I try to tell students that too. If you're going to the internet, make sure you're going to a primary source, even if you're getting it from a Newsweek magazine or something. Where are they getting their information? And make sure that you're paying attention to what you're reading, and is it credible. You can't just believe everything that you read about vaping or marijuana, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So that's my main takeaway, is that our students are confused. There's so much misinformation about marijuana, and they're getting the idea that it's safe for them and that it's harmless.
Yeah, and think about it, I think that's a good point. Like, if educators are saying we need more, if adults who are saying we need more information, we're confused, there's so much out there, what is credible, what is not, right? Imagine how the kids feel, right? And the stakes are so much. The stakes are high. Marijuana is a different drug than it used to be. The stakes are high for everybody, but they're so much higher for youth. Kim, I saw you raise your hand.
Sure, and real quickly, I just put in the chat a link to our Who Knew page, because Susan reminded me that this is so important to have credible data. And that page, as I explained in the text, I won't go on about it, you can read it. But we have citations galore. Everything on there is cited, and it really answers a lot of great questions. And it's not just about the negative effects, it's also there's some positive things that kids can do to make sure that they do develop those healthy coping mechanisms. So just wanted to make sure you all check that out as well.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. And so, what I wanna shift to do is to hear y'all share your own experiences. And so, thank you again, Susan, for sharing your experience. And I think one thing that you mentioned, right, media literacy, prevention goes so much beyond saying this is the risk with marijuana, this is the risk with alcohol. part of YMPP curriculum, one of the pillars that I'll talk about in a moment is media literacy, right? That is a skill. That is a skill that kids can use, way beyond just prevention education, right? In today's climate, with like all of the information that's out there and news sources that might not be the most credible, and like all, the internet, right? When you have all of these, anything that you can think of, you can find information on, but is that information credible, and should that information be driving your decision making? Super, super important. So let me share my screen again. So for the questions that I'm going to ask everyone doing, like I said, I will send these out to the breakout rooms, which I'm going to send in a moment. I think it's really important, when we do breakout rooms, that you all are aware of like what the assignment is before we break out, right? So please take 10 minutes to, you're going to have 3 to 4 people in each group to go through these questions. Right, so you'll lose the slide. So again, I'll come to the breakout rooms and drop these questions in. But what has your experience been with having conversations about marijuana and other drugs with students? What were, right, for those of you who've done prevention education, like think about what it was like when you first started. Fears you're having about having the conversation with marijuana with students. What are some of the successes that you've had? And then as an educator, where do you need support? Right, so let's get that conversation going. I'm going to press the button to start the breakout rooms, and I will send that message to everybody, and I will also come in and drop these questions in. So I was able to jump around, put those questions in the chat box, and I was hearing some interesting things as people shared their own experience. So thank you all for indulging me in that, and being willing to share your experiences as it relates to this topic. I heard some common things being said as I went through the rooms, and so what I would like to do, I'm going to share my screen again, and what I would like to do is I invite some individuals, whoever is comfortable, to unmute your mic, maybe share some your experience, or maybe speak to experience that other individuals shared, and common trends that you saw, or experiences that were shared among your group. So I'm going to just go through the questions, and again, like I said, feel free to unmute or type it into the chat box. I think unmuting and sharing your experience might be a little bit easier, because I can't see the chat right now from where I am as a facilitator. So question number 1, what has your experience been with having conversations about marijuana and other drugs with students?
Hi, for me, I work with kindergarten to 8th graders, and we mainly focus on drug awareness and prevention from 5th to 8th graders. And so the experience, a lot of them know, of course, street terminology or what some of the things that are out on the street. But when I talk to them about the health risk and the potency of marijuana and other drugs, and the flavors and things like that, and additives of what's in the products that's being sold and how it affects, then they learn more, and they find that they did not know, and they wasn't aware, or they knew a lot but not on a technical term of how these things affect their bodies. And in other words, the ugly side of the story, you know they find that they don't really know. They may see some things within their families or their neighborhoods, but when it comes to technical, they don't know that part, but they know a
Wow.
lot. They're aware of a lot.
So you educate K through 8.
Yes.
Yeah. And can I ask you a question about like the younger kiddos? Do they have, I'm asking it, and I have an idea. I think I have an idea. Maybe go. Are they picking up on issues around cannabis? Do they have any idea?
Actually, yeah, because it depending on the neighborhood and what they're exposed to, but they can point, because we use with, say for example, we start early as kindergarten, and it's not as technical as the older, but it's age appropriate, grade appropriate pictures, what's healthy, what's not healthy. So we may have a picture of a cigarette, and and point out what's healthy, what's not, but they are aware of alcohol, they are aware of tobacco, they are aware of marijuana. They know what that leaf looks like, what it means. You know, they can tell me that, you know. And so when we tell stories or our storytelling in our curriculums that we use, it's geared toward more so about safety and what's healthy, what's good to put in your body and what's not. So those stories are based around characters or puppets and things like that to just to provide more of an awareness. So with the kindergarten, first and second, we don't really focus on marijuana. It's more so like tobacco and alcohol when it comes to awareness of, but I do touch, you know, touch on the topic, but not as specifically as I do with the older grades. But they're aware. They point out and tell me some things.
Yeah, I think, and so thank you so much. I think that's super important to highlight, right? Because I think what we're going to hear when it comes to fears is, you know, introducing information too early. And I like to, I asked you for that, for your experience with that, right? And age appropriate is the key word there, right? Making sure that the education that we're providing is age appropriate. But young kiddos, they know already, and they're sponges, right? And so they are already seeing this information, and they're already trying to make sense of it. And so that's an opportunity that we have as educators to make sure that we are, as early and age appropriately as possible, helping them make sense of it in a way that is healthy, right? Using the tools that we have at an age appropriate level. So I think that's very important. All right, so can someone just very quickly, number 2, right, just share some common fears, right? So that, you know, educators express during your breakout group. So please, anyone, feel free to unmute and share their experience with some common fears that that were shared.
For me, with the upper grades, is they are already, some of them are a lot of them are already aware of some of the marijuana products, but when I start talking more technical about the edibles and things like that, sometimes there's more of an inquisitiveness about those products that seem more glamorized and more attractive because they're making it to be more like candy or kid friendly. So my concern would be them wanting to experiment more because of how it looks or of, you know, the talk about the flavors and things like that.
Yeah, and you know what? You know how much money people spend on market research and advertising, right? You know, there's a reason it's a billion-dollar industry, right? It works, and so I get that. I think I understand like the fear of like, again, like, you know, talking about those things and introducing that information. Here are some of the things that I heard, right? um, you know, when I was bopping around, right? Well, you know, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a doctor. Like, am I giving the right information, right? And what if I say the wrong thing? You know, something I didn't hear today when I was bopping around the rooms, but I've heard before is what if students ask me about my own use, right? How do I respond? And you know, one question I want to ask educators, because we're going to talk about what works and what doesn't in this half, right? And I'm going to move into it quickly because we're limited on time, so I want to make sure we cover everything. But thank you so much, Charlita, for sharing your experiences in the group. I really appreciate that. How much of this fear comes from our own experiences with prevention education, right? I grew up during you know, again, I graduated high school in 2007, but I started receiving education around substances in the early 2000s, even before that, right? And a lot of scare tactics were used. You know, there was you know, I won't name programs, but I'm going to go into that in a moment. But the program I received, you know, talked about, you know, joining gangs and, you know, growing up in Devon, Pennsylvania, that didn't really seem relevant to my experience, right? Like, so like how much of our fear is based on, you know, maybe prevention programming that didn't work when we were younger, and now has been researched and studied to actually have had adverse effects on substance use in communities. So I get that that is real, right? But what we're trying to do, I'm going to talk about the pillars of the YMPP curriculum, is we can learn, we can learn from the past and we can be better educators, and prevention is always changing and evolving. So I just want to say that to kind of hopefully empower everybody to know that like this is something that you can learn to do. This is something that you can learn to do effectively. You don't need to have all the answers, and you can always say to young people like, you know what, I don't know, and I will get you that information, and they will respect that more than answering a question or trying to answer a question that you don't have the information to provide an accurate information for or answer for. So we're going to review what works and what doesn't work. We're going to develop a plan to implement the curriculum, and we're going to review new additions to the curriculum itself. All right, so I enjoyed putting this together, right? So the history of prevention, right? Just going all the way back to the 1990s, the temperance movements, right? I love the image. I can't help but laugh, but the lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, right? The temperance movement, right, focuses on the moral evils of alcohol, tobacco, opium, and other drugs, right? Again, that using scare tactics and moralizing substance use. That is a big no-no from my point of view as a prevention educator. Saying substance, you're a good person or a bad person, right? Or only bad people use the substance. That is not effective. That is not productive. And we have young people in the classroom who, 1 in 4 people are impacted about addiction. That's very stigmatizing. We don't want to use that language. So let's not repeat history. But you'll see that moralizing of substance use and that language used in several more recent prevention strategies. 1930s. So also something that I found really interesting as I was going and building these slides. Not all of these prevention tactics were terrible. Not all of them, we can learn something from them, right? And so the 1930s responsible use program, wait until one is grown up. Now, grown up in the 1930s was 18 years old. Now that we have more information on the developing brain, right, we're saying delay use, postpone use till 25, and the legal drinking age and the adult use age of cannabis is 21. So I think we could take that into today, right? So there's something to take away from there. 1960s, again, fear-based models, something that again frightens individuals about the potential negative effects of drug use. 1970s, social influence-based programs. One of the things that does work for effective prevention education is peer-led initiatives. Having young people talk to other young people about the choice why they make the choices why they choose not to use alcohol or other drugs, and modeling responsible peer decision making. So not all bad, right? All right. So this is the thing when when I tell someone I do prevention education, I think in my own mind I believe that they perceive me to be doing this, right? I'm like I gotta clarify, this is not what I'm doing, right? So 1982, Nancy Reagan, just say no. Again, just say no. It's a lot more complicated than that, right? So let's give kids the tools that they need to know how to say no, right? Let's do role playing with refusal skills, like all that stuff that we know that works today, that just say no really didn't have an impact on or decrease substance use. The DARE program, right? Facilitated by police officers, focuses on gangs and violence behavior as well as substance use, right? Again, another, research has shown that, this program didn't really decrease substance use. Partnership for a Drug-Free America, you'll see the skillet in the pan, or the egg in the frying pan, right? This is your brain on drugs, any questions? When I see that ad, I'm like, yeah, I have a lot of questions that didn't get answered by this ad. So, fear tactics, they don't work, right? And then some other examples of programs that we can learn from moving forward in the past. And I think a lot of the fear, that comes from educators is that, I'm going to do harm. And, what I think the common thread and common denominator why everyone's here today is they want to make a difference in the lives of young people. And so, there's ways to do that are proven to work. that are proven to be effective, and you can do that, right? So examples of other programs: Mothers Against Drunk Driving, now Mothers Against Destructive Decisions, right? They actually saw inverse or adverse effects when they would bring a car wreck on campus. They saw rates of drinking increase. So Teen Intervene, too good for drugs. I just want to point out, right? This is an evidence-based program, but that language, right? Too good for drugs. Again, it has that moralizing of substance use, and then Scared Straight, which we know doesn't work. Effective campaigns and prevention programs. I talked about one that is highly funded and highly effective is the life skills training program. Again, that is training, providing young people with the skills, and not even young people, also adults and marginalized populations with the skills to manage things that impact our health. The Truth Campaign, these are amazing nicotine and campaigns, and the Real Cost Campaign, another wonderful example of a campaign that really is impactful. Health focused, a lot of them. Also, other things that work for young people, like when you look at the Truth Campaign, right, there's that really gnarly ad, as I would put it, where a kid takes out a tooth to pay for a pack of cigarettes, right? Superficial prevention strategies work and are impactful on teens. Another prevention strategy that works with young people when it comes to campaigns specifically, not so much programs, is the big tobacco wants your money. Fat cats, these capitalist fat cats want your money, or they're manipulating you, and they don't really care about you. They just your dollar signs to them. And really, teens don't like that. So just things to keep in mind. So let's learn from our history, right? The prevention field has matured. I talked about earlier, for the prevention programs I just reviewed, not all prevention programs are equal, but not all prevention strategies are equal. And, the IQ, conversation about IQ might not really mean a lot to one kid, but the conversation about athletics might mean a lot about to one, have an impact on another, right? So, and I think it's important to say that even though some of these programs and strategies are well-intentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're effective, right? And that's where I see one of the fears. Like, I want to make a difference. I have good intentions, but I'm nervous I'm going to say the wrong thing or introduce something to someone at, too young. So our curriculum, we have a 5th grade curriculum, middle school and high school curriculum that are all designed to be age appropriate for kids typically at that level. And also, let me just say, your kids, your students better than anybody else. If you think, hey, they're actually more mature than this, they might need, to step it up, or like, hey, maybe we need to scale it back. This curriculum might be too mature. You can make that call, right? Effective prevention meets students where they're at developmentally. All right, so what doesn't work? Fear, arousal, scare tactics. Personal stories of recovery when they're not backed up with facts, right? So just like a one and done, like, hey, here's my story and it was really scary and my life is not, good. No, that doesn't work. But when personal stories of recovery are, shared with from a perspective of, if I knew then what I knew now, and this is how the negative consequences I experience, and this is what happens to my brain, right? When you can incorporate curriculum into a personal story, it has more of an impact than just that, again, personal story where, maybe individual was a drunk driver or was in a crash or like had one of those severe negative consequences that, it's hard for young people to relate to. They kind of other that person, like that will never happen to me. That's less effective than the personal story shared with facts and data and information about the brain. Mock car crashes, the moralistic approach, right? Remember that temperance movement, and then we saw a lot of that in the 80s again, the early 90s. Fact sheets. So when I say fact sheets, I mean you go walk into the nurse's office and you see a list of pictures of substances, and this is Vicodin, this is Percocet, this is that's and this is a Smartie. I was looking at know what you're taking, right? It just, again, not helpful. And then myth busting, and the reason why that myth busting doesn't seem to be effective is young people seem to remember the myths more than they remember the facts. So, and that goes for truth and false as well. People don't necessarily remember the truth rather than what was false about the information, the piece of information that you're trying to get in them. And then exaggerated social norms, right? Exaggerated being the key word there, right? Like, let's look at numbers that are relevant to the young people's experience. All right, so what is modern day prevention? You heard me say this earlier. Modern day prevention is not just, okay, here's what you need to know, you're good, boom. It's a collaborative process. Y'all talked about some kids talking about their parents' use, like those kids are at higher risk than kids whose parents are not engaging in use of substances. You talked about misinformation. I mentioned earlier about, my biggest fear of the negative consequences of this pandemic on the mental health and substance use behaviors of young people are that their protective factors were taken away during the past 18 months. So, right, so what is modern day prevention? It's a collaborative process that reduces risk, intervenes on unhealthy behaviors, and nurtures protective factors, right? So helps kids, in all three different realms of this, I think is super important. And education is just one piece of that. So we're going to talk about the YMPP curriculum and primary prevention, which is providing education, right? So there's really three different types of prevention, right? It's primary, secondary, and tertiary. We're not going to worry about tertiary. That is for more, that's really, we're focusing on addiction at that point, right? And, other harm reduction models. So when it comes to being an educator, when we look at the numbers of substance use and cannabis use specifically, these two models really apply, right? The majority of kids are making healthy choices, right? So let me just say real quick, for those of you who are like, does prevention really work, right? Yes, the majority of young people are making healthy choices. It does work, right? And I think it's really hard. It's really hard to measure prevention, right? Because how do you measure prevention? It's the absence of a tragedy, right? It's the kids that are doing the things that they do every single day and making healthy choices, the majority of young people, right? But we often see the majority of young people are making healthy choices, and a very loud minority of young people are making unhealthy choices. Again, they're not bad kids, but we hear about those individuals more. And so sometimes when we ask ourselves as educators, does this really work? I think we do have to remind ourselves of the social norms in our own, like that we teach on, right? Yes, the majority of young people make healthy choices. Part of that is because their parents, right? Part of that is because the resources they have access to. Part of that is because of the education, right? Those three prongs that I talked about, right, earlier about what collaborative prevention is. So, primary prevention with cannabis is addressing misinformation, educating individuals on the risks associated with them, making students feel heard and answering their questions, and then, like I said, discussing protective factors. And when we talk about secondary prevention, that's really focused at the 22% of 12th graders who have used marijuana in the past 30 days. You're still talking to them in the classroom, right? So how can we approach a conversation with them? For those of you who are SAT providers on our call today, right, that's where brief intervention comes in. So, all right. So modern day prevention approaches that do work. Building social and personal skills, right? So empowering students to, advocate for themselves, know how to say no. Personal skills also mean coping skills, making sure they have healthy coping skills. Cite immediate consequences, right? I talked about earlier how that individual who comes in and they have that one-time assembly that talks about that really bad night, right? That happens. That happens all the time, right? That terrible negative consequence from one-time substance use, right? Like that is a reality. Unfortunately, it's again, like I said, kids will other that individual and say, yeah, but that's not going to happen to me. So let's make the negative consequences that are a product of substance use tangible, relevant, academic, athletics, social, peer groups, parents, right? All of those things matter, and they need to be discussed when we talk about the immediate consequences of substance use. Positive peer norms, right? That the majority of young people make healthy choices. And then involve youth peer-led components, right? So youth sharing their experiences, their choices not to use, right? Like there's prevention programs, that the acronym is SALSA, Students Advocating for Life Without Substance Abuse, right? That are in schools and communities that share like why they make a choice not to use. It's also really important that those students that are part of those groups are actually making that choice not to use, right? So, that's tricky, but that's a whole program and prevention program that can even be implemented in communities themselves. All right. So these are meaningful conversations. And, Susan shared the experience, right? You walk into a classroom and the kids find out you're gonna be talking about, marijuana, and you got a kid like, in that in that image that puts their head down immediately. You have the jokester who might, challenge you, or you might have a classroom that's completely silent and just like, oh, here we go, who's the stranger, right? So, if you are an educator that gets to provide this curriculum to students that you work with every single day, you have an amazing opportunity to do so. These are some of the things that we all should consider when having this conversation. We are the facilitators, right? So we're going to be providing this education, but it's super important that we're kind of taking the temperature of the room and listening. Students, like I said, they have access to so much information. They're hearing so many things. So you're going to hear some things that seem quite wild to you, right? So I want you to keep an open mind. But it's important you keep an open mind because that's their norm. Like they're hearing things like cannabis cures cancer, right? So when a student is vulnerable enough to throw that out there, right, it's important that we don't make them feel, for lack of a better term, stupid, right? Which I know no one's trying to do that, right? So but that's the outrageous stuff that they're hearing out there, right? So let's normalize that. That's an opportunity to say, yeah, that and a lot of other misinformation and disinformation is out there about the substance. Sense of humor is always good, can't hurt. This conversation needs to be non-judgmental. If you are the one who's grading their papers, right? If you're the one who's grading their finals, and that student's very academically driven, right? They look up to you and they want you to have a good perception of them. They might be scared that if they, talk openly or let you on to knowing that they know information about marijuana, that you might have a certain perception of them. So super important that that is made, that this comes across as non-judgmental and you speak to that, right? Limits of confidentiality. You're not, we're all, if we're working with young people, we all are mandated reporters. And if they say something that is super concerning, we're going to have to report that. So let them know that this is a safe conversation. It's tended to be a conversation, but if you say something that's going to, put yourself at risk or somebody else, I need to report that. Boundaries. You don't have to answer questions about your own personal use. I think you can acknowledge the question and say, it's thank you for asking that. That's not a comfortable question I feel comfortable answering, right? It's a boundary I have as an educator, and this is my, so you can feel free to set boundaries around questions around your own personal relationship to alcohol or other drugs if they come up. And then really, flexibility is important, but I also really want to just kind of, again, we're coming close on time, not having all the answers. If you don't have the answer, don't try to answer the question. Let them know that you're going to get back to them. Students will respect that. That's super important. All right. So, pillars of the YMPB curriculum. We already talked about one of them, media literacy. And so this is what I'm going to go into. This is all incorporated into the curriculum itself. So this within itself is a curriculum overview, right? So media literacy, social norms, focus on health, postponement of use. All of these things have been shown, right, when approached in a way that engages young people, makes them equal partners in the conversation, have given them not just the information they need to know to make a healthy choice, but the tools they need to have to access information that's also going to empower them to make a healthy choice. All right, so disinformation and misinformation is so widespread on marijuana. I think I really stand by that the number one risk that faces young people when it comes to this topic is misinformation and disinformation and the confusion that they experience, right? So that is also complicated by state legalization and adult use. I'm trying to make an effort so y'all know, right, to switch the language, from recreational use to adult use of cannabis. because recreational sounds fun, right? It's giving off, recreation, like, recess. Like it's giving off the idea that it is something people do for fun, which isn't not true, right? But I guess a small, adjustments to our language, I think, are really important over time. So where you get your information, can impact your health, right? So, I love the example Susan gave earlier. When people say, well, that's not what I heard. Well, where did you get that information, right? And part of why MPB curriculum, especially at the high school level, focuses on, you know, making sure they're getting it from a credible source, and what a credible source is versus a non-credible source, right? Did you get that from SAMHSA, or did you get that from hightimes.com, right? Important, important to distinguish, right? Or did you get that from Wikipedia, or did you get that from, Normal, right? Which is the nationwide movement to legalize cannabis. Super important to distinguish. Or did you get that from your favorite YouTuber, right? Or your favorite TikToker? Like, where did you get that information from? Headlines, right? I've done it before. I've done it, as an adult. Like, hey, did you hear that? Blah blah blah. I just cite the headline. Did I read the whole article? No, right? Misleading news stories. They might, about cannabis. They're out there. I see them all the time. Anecdotal experiences, right? Hey, my kid, this has worked for their anxiety, and so I think it will work for your kid's anxiety. Or this, this was the only thing that helped me get through my chemotherapy, right? Like, okay, that's not saying that that person doesn't have a right to their own healthcare, but that is their experience, and that's not going to be the experience of everybody, and nor should it be the general expectation that that is going to improve your experience. Cannabis is going to improve your experience with your chemo treatment or your anxiety or XYZ, right? And then social media, like I mentioned before, right? TikTok is filled with misinformation, disinformation, and is, being consumed at a very high rate, especially during the past 18 months. Pop culture, for every, I think one good thing to bring up to young people when it comes to media literacy, right, is, and again, this is part of the curriculum. For every negative anecdote or fact or consequence we discuss about marijuana, how many positive things are they hearing in pop culture through, like, in music, or again, from actors, even athletes, right? When we see it, these very successful people who engage in cannabis use and are millionaires and are the top athletes in their field, or have an amazing songwriting career, like, they are the exception, not, the standard. The majority of cannabis users that go on to develop cannabis use disorder aren't, like, the number one at what they do, or achieving the dreams that they thought they would, right? It's one of the consequences of their use, right? But when we see these individuals who are really successful, have a lot of fame, have a lot of money, I think young people see, like, like, it's not that bad, right? So, important to just highlight. And then social media, right? I think we all know, social media is such a powerful tool. I think, and it goes both ways. And I think as an adults, we are starting to understand the ways in which social media, young people use it to support each other, which I think is a very important part of the conversation. Not to say that it's all bad. I think there is some good that comes from social media use in young people, but I think there are some risks, right? Certainly, when it comes to social media. Okay, so social norms. You saw these numbers before. Where did I go? Okay, yeah. So social norms, right? And highlighting that the majority of young people are not using substances. Bringing these numbers, having students, when you ask them what is their perception, right? Get into their heads, really try to understand the beginning of your classes, when you're using this curriculum, when you're talking about these numbers, how do you perceive substance use in our community? What is your estimate of how many young people use how many 8th graders use marijuana in a year, or what percentage of 12th graders, right? And you can do this with the younger kids. You can say to 8th graders, how many 12th graders do you think are using marijuana? I guarantee you they're going to way overestimate the actual use of cannabis in their community, right? And giving that information in 8th grade is super important, because we know that transition from 8th grade to 9th grade is a riskier, right? Because the pressure to fit in high school, if they have that perception that everyone's doing it in high school, they're at a higher risk, right? So we have social norms built into the curriculum. Focus on health. I talked a lot about the developing brain as an overview of information, but when you talk about cannabis, and Kim sees this every single day, people often want to derail the conversation about, maybe derailing is not the best word to use. Like, people have feelings and opinions and are curious and are interested in other aspects of the conversation around cannabis that are not related to health, right? So, when it comes to, legalization and the war on drugs, right? When it comes to medicinal marijuana, when it comes to, many other topics as it relates to weed. As educators with this curriculum, your main goal is to bring it back to the conversation of health. You say, yes, that may be true, right? And maybe we can, if someone brings up the social justice aspect of the conversation of cannabis, which I guarantee you, Gen Z, they absolutely will. I think that's a great opportunity to enhance the curriculum and the conversation beyond this lesson, and maybe assign a paper on that topic, right? Or have students do a presentation on that topic, right? And honestly, like, when it comes to the social justice piece, there's a lot of arguments on both ends that I think are very valid, that we all need to consider, right? Which, as the educator, you can facilitate later on. And I know Kim has resources on her website where you can look to find out more information about that on. But people will, young people will say, yeah, but like, what about this? What about that, right? Your job with the YMPP curriculum and talking about marijuana is to acknowledge that, affirm that. Maybe there's more teachable moments in the future about that topic, but let's bring it back to health, right? Because that is research backed. We know the health implications that cannabis, the consequences that cannabis presents to the developing brain. We know what it does to the lungs, right? We know about THC poisoning. We know about its impact on mental health. We can speak to that. We can direct them to the CDC, to SAMHSA, to all of that. Focusing on health is super important. And then, super important language, which is always evolving, right? Like I said, like I'm working on saying cannabis. I'm working instead of marijuana. I'm working on saying adult use instead of recreational use, and it's constantly evolving. And so, just doing your best to keep up with that. But one thing that is very certain, right, is we don't just say no. We don't say don't do drugs. We don't say drugs are bad. That's not helpful. They've heard that. I heard that. Didn't work for me. Didn't work for a lot of people. All right, we're beyond that. So postponement of use, right, focuses on, I can give a why. I can say, look, 25, here are the health risks, but you're an adult then, and you can make the choice to use or not. But here's what we know why you should postpone use right now at your age, and point to the developing brain, right? So this aligns perfectly with the health-based approach to prevention. And something I always love to tell young people, and this is included in the curriculum as well, is every year that an individual delays use of alcohol or marijuana or other drugs, they lower the risk by addiction, starting at the age of 15 by 14%, right? So I use my hands, right? I say, this is age of first use, or sorry, this is risk for addiction. This is age of first use, right? Every year you delay use, you lower your risk of developing an addiction, right? You're allowing your brain the way that it's intended to, and you're lowering your risk. Now at age 25, if you start using cannabis, is there still a risk? Yes, absolutely, right? But you significantly decrease that risk. And that is our goal, right? Our goal is to significantly decrease that risk for developing an addiction, postponing use, delaying use, whatever the words are. All right, now we are shifting into secondary prevention. And again, the percentage of 30-day use, you've now seen this 3 times on this presentation, all right? Why? Well, look, when we look at this spectrum of adolescent use, right, the majority of them are not using, right? Primary prevention works. That's amazing. That's incredible. But we have some, right? 22.3% of 12th graders who are engaging in use. All right. So, and let me just say this. Primary prevention still works for those young people. I've done many, in my years of prevention, I've gone into classrooms, right? And I get a sense of the kids are using, because I was one of them, right? I know who they are, because that was me when I look into the audience of the kids that I'm working with. And after being with the kids for some time, I have the luxury of working with young kids for like 4 days at a moment, right? Or during intensive student education. I'll have kids come up to me and say, hey, I'm concerned about my own use. I learned something this week or this session from you that I did not know. And, I want to cut back on my marijuana use, or I'm going to stop using. That happens more often than I thought it would when I first started doing this work, right? So we also got to be aware that, primary prevention impacts those kids. They're hearing this piece of information for the first time. If they're not in that, substantial to severe range yet of use, we have an opportunity to make an impact on them. All right, so I took this from Ira Sankoff. This was the presentation that I was referring to earlier that Kim suggested that I watched, and I'm so glad that I watched. But this is a graph of kind of a potential graph of what someone's use could look like, right? And I actually use something very similar in the classroom with young people to talk about progression and tolerance and baselines, right? And dopamine and serotonin levels and stuff like that. But for a lot of young people, they use because it's fun, right? So when we think about the reasons for use, because they're stressed, because it's fun, because they're bored, right? Those are some of the top 3 reasons why young people report using. And so, what is typically the first negative consequence? Typically they got caught, right? Kim and I were talking about that earlier when we said, right, all right, parents working from home, kids working from home. All right, now we're figuring out we got an issue, right, with marijuana, with cannabis use. And so I love what Ira said during his presentation, right? What's the reward? The reward for those staff providers on the call is they get to meet with you. But also this moment, right? This is where secondary prevention and primary prevention overlap. This moment is such an opportunity to make a significant change in young people's life through secondary prevention and brief intervention, right? Whatever you want to call it, I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably. We, like I said, oftentimes kids that, are engaging in regular use, they may not have had a negative consequence yet. They just need that piece of information to say, you know what, my lacrosse career is too important to me to keep using weed and to threaten my motor skills. All right, I gotta, reduce, or I gotta stop. For a lot of young people, that will do it, right? The other hand, right, we know the definition of addiction is the repetitive compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite negative consequences, and they will continue to use. So this is important. Secondary prevention is important. It provides an opportunity to talk about all these things. So here's the deal. We got a couple minutes left. I'm trying to be mindful of time. Like I said earlier, this presentation itself is going to be made available to you. This recording of the presentation is going to be made available to you. So I'm going to go through some of these slides so we can focus on the YMPP curriculum for the remaining couple minutes of our session today and what is actually available to you, right? So real quick, do these services make a difference? Absolutely. People that received support after meeting with brief interventionists or, support services were found to use fewer drugs. When parents are involved, right? There's a better outcome. Again, we say postpone use, right, as a primary prevention strategy, but if we can disrupt use, if we can make it, instead of regular, make it far apart, again, we're allowing that brain to develop the way that it's intended to. It's an important part of prevention. All right, and so this is the stage of change. I don't have time to go over that, but All right, so the YMPP curriculum itself. We have a 5th grade curriculum. For those who are concerned with introducing information that is maybe perceived as too mature, right? We've developed a 5th grade curriculum that, and so 5th grade and 8th grade, way different. 9th grade and 12th grade, way different, right? So this curriculum, just so you all know, is not, you can take it and use it any way that you want. These are recommendations. Like I said earlier, you are educators that are and know your students better than I ever could. So please just be mindful of that, right? So for those who are, want to start with the younger kiddos, like the 5th grade curriculum really focuses on what is a drug, what is a medication, right? We don't take other people's medications. What is addiction, right? And marijuana. Again, like I really appreciated the input from one of our attendees today. Like these young kiddos are already starting to develop some idea of what these things are. So let's get in there and make sure that we can provide them with accurate information, right? So they don't have to find that information on their own. So when it goes to middle school, right, marijuana basics, some of the things that I went over today, marijuana in the brain, marijuana in our general health that focuses more on the body, and then staying healthy and refusal skills, right? So that's that nurturing protective factors. What are ways that we can nurture protective factors, provide you with coping skills to make you make healthy choices, to not experience stress at such high rates? And then refusal skills, and some of that involves some role playing with how to say no, right? Not just say no, how to say no. What does that look like? What might you feel when you say no? Let's talk about that. And then the YMPP high school curriculum, right? So this is really like, we want, when it comes to high schoolers, they have thoughts, they have opinions, they are seeing this behavior occur in their community. Let's engage those prefrontal cortex and get them working, right, to engage critically with this content. Again, providing that foundation. Again, we got it at high school level. People might be coming from different schools. We can't make a judgment or say like, yeah, they all have this information already. We might not know that, right? They might have moved or went from a private school to a public school, right? So we got to provide them a foundation, and then talk about the impact on the developing brain. Again, that is their number one thing that they're interested in. Health, body, media literacy. That this is like, again, like this is teaching somebody how to fish, right? Essentially, we want to be able to empower you to be able to find this information on your own, right? That's where I was talking about. If the conversation deviates from health and people talk about the social justice aspect of cannabis, right? Like, let's have an assignment added on to this lesson plan where they get to write a paper on that, right? And make sure that they're citing correct sources and they're looking at both ends of that social justice aspect. And then staying healthy and helping others. The number one question I get every single time I go into the school after being there for a couple of days is, how do I help my friend? Right? So not only does this last piece talk about how they can stay healthy themselves, stress management, remember stress being the number one reason why young people report using cannabis, but also how to have a conversation with a friend that they're concerned about. Okay. So the Educator's Handbook, it's available to you at conversation.zone/need-to-know. And this year, it will be made available to you this Monday. There's some new activities. There's a visual guide, right, for those who are visual learners to help individuals understand addiction. A video that does a really good job talking about tolerance, progression, the disease of addiction, and works at all age levels that I found. So the information's in that video is included in there. Stress reduction, right? If stress is the number one reason why young people report using cannabis and other drugs, then let's nurture that protective factor and provide them with coping skills to make healthier choices than picking up cannabis. So there's a box breathing exercise in there for that. And then there's the ripple effect, right? And this is for older students who, say, it's my body. I'm almost 18 years old. It's my choice, right? But it looks at the impact on family systems, right? For those who are counselors, like the impact on your peer relationships, the impact on your parents, right? The impact on the community. It's an exercise to help young people really look at why addiction and substance use is a community issue. So those are new activities that was requested, right? That we have some more activities to help engage young people with in the classroom. So you'll be able to access that again starting on Monday. we are at 10:59 a.m. This went by faster than I thought it would be. I just want to say give so much thanks to Kim, and be a part of the conversation, as well as Montgomery County. Kim, I will stop talking and hand it back over to you, but thank you all so much for showing up today. And is there any other pieces of information that we need to let them know before we wrap up?
Yes, we want them to take the survey if they want to get Act 48 credits. So that link that I've been posting ad nauseum, I apologize for that. But when people leave and come back in, they lose the chat. So I kept putting it back in there. So it is there. Katie, you're going to send me this PowerPoint as soon as you can, as soon as we get off this call.
Yeah.
I'll load that onto that follow-up page. The recording will be there as soon as YouTube process. Well, first Zoom has to process it, then YouTube has to process it, so it could be this afternoon. In case you want to revisit the video, and as Katie said, everything will be there on Monday. So those Act 48 hours, there's a link for that on the follow-up page, but I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat as well so that you can open it up. Before you leave, you can click in the chat. So sorry, hang on a second. Here's 48, it's an evaluation. Okay, there you go. There's the evaluation. All right. All right. Like someone's comment, who knew 3 hours would go by so fast? I appreciate that. And who knew happens to be our campaign related to Youth Marijuana Prevention Project. So yay. Thank you, Katie. Great job. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy this gorgeous day. Go get some positive ions outside. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.